Welcome to MxM Live. We are here this afternoon with Mr. Matt Atchison. Matt is the creative head of Saffron Brand Consultants. He is here in India for the rebrand, refresh of the ABP News Network. And I'm delighted to have him here with us, speak to us. So let me ask you, let me start with you with a simple question. Talk to us about your experience of the refresh of the ABP News Network.
Oh, crumbs! It's where do you start? Where do you start?
Okay. You're not a hardcore. You all do brand refreshes. You all do brand consulting, but the great from the great Wally to now we're familiar with the work that Saffron has done. But you're not a television news specialist, right? There are specialist design agencies which do this work. So talk to us about the journey that was there.
It's true, yeah. Yes, I mean, obviously there are agencies that are dedicated to media and on-screen communications. I think the project really wasn't so much about just necessarily dealing with the on-screen news channel. It was more about ABP Network as an organization, about the next steps, about building something for the future. And one of the interesting things that we found in the conversations with Avinash and the team here, was a little bit it was more akin to the kind of projects that we obviously regularly do, which are helping organizations organize their portfolio, organize their brand architecture, if you like, organizing the way they set up their visual hierarchies. And so actually, a large part of the project was actually more about the strategic foundations, more about building the framework and giving clarity to ABP Network, which obviously then allows them to sort of say, okay, so if we can clearly understand what ABP Network stands for, then the products that ABP Network produces are obviously at the moment, the public-facing products are the channels. So once we know what ABP Network stands for is about, it's going to be a lot easier to then deal with how we want these product brands to express themselves. And so in actual fact, it was much more of a traditional, let's say, sort of a traditional Saffron job in that sense. It was about organizing the brand strategy and the hierarchies and the architecture more than just the things that we're talking about today.
A news channel is a news channel is a news channel. And this is not just one news channel, right? ABP Network has multiple news channels in multiple languages. So were there any unique challenges that you faced in terms of ensuring that there is this overarching identity that the entire network gets, given the fact that it is there in multiple languages, multiple regions, multiple community preferences, and it should have to work and be relevant for all?
Very much. It's interesting that you make that point, because one of the challenges, let's say, one of the sort of things that we were, as we learned more and more, and we immersed ourselves in the world of ABP News and the channels and the fascinating situation. Actually, somebody here mentioned, as we were talking to them, they said, India is a country, but to understand India would be like sort of saying Europe is a country. So it's almost like countries within countries, languages, right, culture, variety, huge differences culturally across this whole, continent. And And so that was obviously a very important point for us. And we were saying, well, you know, really, and we did go down the track of saying, well, how much visual independence do all of these regional and state channels, you know, under the ABP News identity, how much visual independence do they need? And there was lots of toing and froing and debating, and in the end, obviously what we wanted to do was create something which doesn't just look like another international generic news channel. It wants to feel Indian. It wants to feel, it's definitely, you couldn't change the logo and stick it in North America, or you couldn't change the logo and put it in Europe. It had to feel Indian. But then that we got at that point, it was, you know what, we don't need to now start getting granular with the design and start to sort of create a visual language for each and every region. Because in essence, the language is different, the content is different, and the script, the type, the messages that appear on screen are different. So in actual fact, what you need is that there's a connective fiber, visual fiber that holds this and really pulls equity towards ABP. We want people to recognize this is an ABP news channel. So we don't want it to look so chameleonic that it starts to sort of look like many different things in many different regions. So we said, yeah, we do need to have this unity, visual unity, in the knowledge that the content is actually always going to be different in any region anyway. So that was what we tried to achieve. As I say, this was a process through the project, you know, of presenting ideas and bouncing things back and forth and all the rest of it. And eventually we came to that conclusion.
So let me ask you a very corporate kind of a question, right? You know, in what way is the ABP News Network different from what it was? In what way will it be different tomorrow after the refresh is done, after the new identities are up, to what it is today? How is it going to change?
Well, I think, I mean, again, the future is open. And I think this was a very important thing that we tried to do, was make sure that this was an identity. And as I say, this was a project which was trying to build, it sounds a bit arrogant to say future-proof, but it was almost trying to future-proof the identity so that it can grow almost in any direction. So ABP Network right now is fine. It's the organization behind a series of channels. But as we know what's happening with digitalization, certainly bit by bit more people are using ABP Live, the mobile devices. The ABP Network will need to have flexibility and the ability to perhaps think beyond just news channels, you know, news broadcasting, and actually perhaps, you know, look into other different parts of media and communication, always around a similar field of work, using the expertise that is inherent here, but have that ability to flex and move and build. And so this was one of the reasons why ABP Network, the visual identity for ABP Network, was somewhat separated from those TV channel brands. And again, it was to allow the network now to stand in its own right and almost be able to develop whatever it needs to develop in the future, whether it's more channels or digital access points to news, whatever it might be in the future, and essentially keep the channels as a separate set of products almost of the organization.
You know, you kind of mentioned that in passing about you know, a whole range of TV channels, a slew of TV channels that are there, and the logo is there right on the top. Now, in many ways, almost all news channel readers, the anchors, and the content is on many days the same. Just the logo is different. Now, obviously, you know, when an agency like Saffron is doing this exercise, it's going to be a lot more than just that logo, the brand unit that is there at the end. So could you go us could you give us a more nuanced brand statement that you have perhaps given to the channel as to how things have to change?
Yeah, again, brand, and I think this is obviously, if you ask my mother what is brand, she'd say, oh, isn't that a logo? And of course, it's a common thought in most people's heads. Oh, a brand, you mean a logo, right? You know, and of course, a logo is nothing more than just a symbol of a promise that an organization is making. So you sort of see
right,
a Nike tick, and you think that's a promise of a sports product, a wonderful sports product, great styling, whatever, all of those thoughts that come to mind. So the logo can only ever should be something that triggers a thought, but the experience that is built around that has to be much more rich and much more deep. And so obviously the logo, we've essentially, I mean, to try and sort of summarize what the visual language has been for developing for these channels. Essentially, the logo is still building on the visual heritage of ABP as we know it today, which is essentially a triangle, an arrowhead in a sort of a gold framed box.
Right.
And obviously we didn't want to separate or make such a huge, we're not trying to sort of revolutionize or completely throw all the visual heritage away. The thing was, what's important here? It's this arrow. The arrow is the thing that people recognize. Now the arrow at the moment is sort of locked inside a little, as I say, like almost a gilt cage, if you like. And we were making this euphemism that it's a bit like we wanted to sort of free the bird. We were calling the arrow as if it was the bird. That as soon as you pull it out of that box, you're immediately giving it a sense of freedom. And of course, then that means that, well, why does this arrow have to just live like a logo in the corner? Yes, of course, there will be a logo. The logo needs to be visible at all times. But again, this arrow can have an alter ego. It can represent a little bit the personality of the editorial skills, the way that the journalistic dynamism, the way that ABP will search out information, travel the land, draw attention to things. It can steer you, it can lead you to things, it can move. So we see the arrow actually taking on a much more sort of active, visually active role in the identity. So it doesn't just become this static little bug in the corner. And then around that as well, obviously, it's not just about focusing all the attention on the symbol, it's actually about the whole visual language. And what we wanted to do was make sure that this thing felt fundamentally Indian. And of course, it's very easy to fall into either the trap of cliches or finding all sorts of visual things that perhaps maybe you might find some visual code that is relevant to one part of India and not another. But one thing we found was the fabrics of India, and there was this conversation going on all the time in the creative, in the studio about, the richness and the fabric of India, the fact that all these threads are woven together. There's cultures and people are intertwined, and there's this fundamental fabric. We started looking at fabrics of India and found that all these different regions have wonderful, wonderful fabric designs, beautiful, inlaid golds and things within the fabrics. And we thought, well, if we could come up with a fabric that was an ABP fabric, but somehow felt Indian, connected with the different cultures of India without being specific to any one. And so we have this second layer in the identity, which is this three-dimensional, moving, fluid, always evolving fabric, and you'll see it. I mean, I don't know how much of the identity you've seen, but it will come hopefully to light, and you'll see it. But it's this mix between obviously the symbol, as I was talking about, the symbol becoming a much more purposeful symbol, and then this second layer of connection to the culture of India that we hope will come through and make this obviously very unique to ABP.
I'm going to move a little away from ABP and ask you, in the 25 years that you've been out of design school, how would you say have things changed in design? No, it's a very general question, but there's a reason why I'm asking you this.
Crumbs. Yeah, I've almost got Alzheimer's now. I can barely I can barely remember when I left university. But yeah, I mean, when I started learning the trade, if you like, I mean, it was very, very, very sort of rudimentary. If I go almost back into university, I mean, we were using rotoring pens, you know, letraset. You know, Apple computers were just at the sort of the beginning. And of course, you know, I think we all sort of saw the wonderful potential that computers had back then. I'm sort of talking early 90s now. And of course, without a doubt, I mean, the things that you can do with technology now, I mean, certainly mind-blowing, you know, really what is achievable through the digitalization of design. But I sort of think, you know, you still need to have, as a designer, you still need to have the ability to think beyond the screen, you know, and think in abstract terms and think in creative forms. And so, yeah, I'd sort of say the thing that's perhaps revolutionized everything more than anything is the technology side of design. That's the thing for me that's...
I asked you this question because if you were tasked with the same job, say 15 years back for the refresh of the ABP Net News network, would it be any different from what it is today, what you did today?
A good one. Do you know what? I don't know if the resulting design would be that different. As I say, technology has given us the ability to create these, you know, you have an idea, and we've actually been able to create digitally these moving fabrics, you know, this stuff, which you sort of go, actually, just a few years ago would have been incredibly difficult to try and do that. But I think the thinking, the fundamental thinking, the idea of what we wanted ABP to be, I think that would still be there. I think perhaps the logo and the idea around the logo would still be somewhat the same. And I think the idea, yeah, I think the basis would be the same, if that answers your question.
You know, one of the things that everybody is seeking these days, you know, channel managers, editors, etc., is to look for a younger audience, to be relevant for the Instagram generation, if I might say. Now, did that in any way influence the channel colors, the way you build the identity?
Well, I think the colors were, I mean, actually ABP went from being a predominantly blue channel to being a red and yellow channel, probably whatever it was, 3 years ago or something. And we didn't want to necessarily go and change the colors yet again. And also, I think, as Jacob was mentioning earlier, you know, quite often I think there's a sort of a point at which news is now becoming associated with sort of red and punchy colors. What we did want to do with the design was, and especially just bearing in mind people consuming on mobile devices, smaller screens, was somehow try and get away from a lot of this decorative bling, I'd also call it. And I know all the news channels have been doing it for a long time. You know, it's sort of glossy, shining, gilt 3D objects that spin and rotate and things. And actually, when you're consuming content on a mobile device, you need sort of a crispness and a clarity. And again, that thought of crispness and clarity was sort of very much in line with what we were trying to do strategically, which is about represent that ABP is about crispness and clarity. And so even if you just think, I mean, regardless of the generation, as you were just mentioning about, you know, how would the younger generation connect with this brand? I think by virtue of the fact that it's just hopefully a more practical visual identity for digital means that by virtue of the fact that it's more apt for mobile devices should at least mean that the younger generation connect better to it.
Right, but this is not your blood red, right? Which is there. It's not a you know, if you look at the CMYK code, it's not a hard coded blood red. It's a bit to the orange.
Well, I was sort of thinking it's a pretty sort of pure red. I'm just trying to think of the Pantone color that it is, but it's a bright red. But then built around that are a series of deeper reds, you know, more practical reds for things like, you know, where text appears on screen, where, you know, you might want to make transitions. And when you see the fabric, you'll see the fabric is obviously because of the light and the way the light plays on it, there's lots and lots of tones of red. So if you like, we've sort of taken ownership of the whole gamma of red, you know, as part of the visual language, with accents of gold every now and then to sort of make that link to.
You know, Matt, you must have studied a host of channels, a host of media entities that exist in this country while you were undertaking this redesign. What is your broad view on the brand values of the various media entities that exist?
I think, I mean, obviously we know that hashtag is perhaps one of the biggest competitor, or the biggest, has the biggest draw, perhaps has a more, historically had a more modern visual language, you know, and they've always been, appear to have been very, trying to be as cutting edge with their design and brand language as they possibly can. But one of the things we noticed, I mean, when you laid out all of the news channels that we could find in India, and you don't just look at the logos, you look at the whole visual language of all of these channels. The newsrooms, the on-screen assets, the web, and you lay them all out and you put them all up side by side, and you say, you know, what's happening here is that everybody is copying everybody else. Everybody is sort of, oh, I like that. Let me do an interpretation of that for my channel. Somebody else, you know, and eventually what's happened is this sort of an arms race, a visual arms race has happened in news channels in India. And what you see is that actually everything's starting to look a bit the same. You know, people are using similar visual codes. So again, it was one of the sort of desires was to sort of like say, damn it, we need to really push and try and create some distance to the competition, try and build something that really belongs to ABP and isn't something that's going to be just that you could just copy because you don't have the moral right, do you know what I mean, to copy it. It's got to be the identity that I hope we have successfully created for ABP can only be ABP because it's linked to the DNA of the organization. It's linked to the strategy of the organization, and it can only be ABP. So I think it was essentially that what we were trying to do with ABP was make a bigger jump away, differentiate visually, and hopefully create something that nobody else can copy, that is really unique to ABP because it's built on the strategy for ABP and the DNA of ABP. So we would like to think that, each of the news channels will also have to go and dig deep, and if they want to update their identities, dig deep and take a look at what matters to them and how they could reflect their organization visually.
Or perhaps they need to hire Saffron and get Matt over to do their design. Tell me, Matt, you and Saffron, y'all are mandated with multiple redesign, branding efforts, etc. At what stage do you think that your effort of rebranding, of refreshing, of giving an entity a new brand life is successful? And so specifically, at what stage would you think that your work on the ABP News Network refresh would be successful?
It's a tricky one, that, and it's always been for me a little bit of one of those things where if you look at advertising is always full of facts and figures and conversion rates and success rates based on campaigns and how much impact that campaign has had.
What advertising was all about, exaggeration.
Yeah, exactly, exaggerating everything. But of course, the impact that this campaign has had has drawn 40 million people around the world, blah, 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 whatever. So it always seems as if there's an ability to sort of put figures to the success of advertising. Whereas branding is a sort of a strange thing in that it's difficult to pinpoint exactly the success and impact it has, because obviously even branding is sort of lost in advertising as well. I mean, brand sort of permeates a whole organization. It goes from the sort of the tone of voice of the if you pick up a telephone and make a telephone call to the organization, what is that voice saying to you? What is that, the tone they're using? What's the color palette that they use in the advertising? The typefaces, all of these things, it permeates everything. So it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint what success looks like for a brand. But I think, and it might be that in 10 years time, you look back and you sort of say, hey, we did that brand 10 years ago and it's still going strong. I mean, when I think about one of the telcos that I was working with in Austria, and we did the job over 10 years ago, and the identity is still being used there. They've expanded beyond Austria into lots and lots of other countries in the region, in the area of Europe, and it's still going strong, that original identity system. And so I guess you sort of look at it and say, well, that's a sort of a successful brand. It's become one of the best, certainly the best known telco in Austria. But as I say, I think there's a certain amount of educated guesswork, I guess, and you think, well, we've built something that is built on the DNA of this organization, hopefully reflects well the DNA of this organization. And if the advertising agencies and the communications and the way the brand works in rollout is successful, then I think there's no reason why it shouldn't be successful.
Well, we all hope and we are sure that it will be successful. Thank you very much, Matt, for sparing your time. I know you've been very busy. You've just you're getting set for the refresh tomorrow morning. That is today morning when this interview appears. So thank you very much for your time, and all the very best, and hope to speak to you once again to celebrate the success of ABP News rebranding, as well as your next projects here in India.
Well, that's very kind, and thank you very much for your time as well. And well, hopefully we'll get to talk again soon.
Thank you.